There's an old ethical thought experiment that asks the question, if you were to design your own society from scratch, creating all of the leaders and the upper class and the working class and the lower class, and all of the parts that go into a society, how would you design it? The catch? You don't know where in the society you'll wind up after making it. Normally, when people are asked this question, they create some form of social structure that has a pretty high floor. Because when you're in charge of creating your own destiny, you want to make sure that you can't fall quite so far. Most people are used to creating some kind of social structure that ensures that even the lowest in society have basic needs met. Sometimes it even tiptoes toward a level of communism or socialism that would probably get me called to Joe McCarthy if this was a sermon given in 1970. But for our purposes, we get the chance to ask this question because it invites us to think about what would it look like for us to build an empathic society? What would it look like for us to build a community and a culture that asked, how can we best look out for everybody, not just who can take care of themselves? Now, you might be asking, why are we talking about this when we're about to talk about Torah? Why doesn't the Torah just create a more perfect view of society? After all, if this is supposed to be some kind of word of God that we're transmitting, why is it that we agree to the terms that people should suffer and there should be hardship in this perfect vision of God's people and God's world? Now, the easiest, most obvious answer is because we know that the reality is some people encounter more hardship than others. And we all know that when we're evaluating our religious ideology, we have to make sure that reality can fit in it. If it's so beautiful and so grandiose that it doesn't match anything of our lived reality, we reject the religion altogether. So our texts, our Torah, has to ensure that some form of the realism of what's going on in our world is reflected. But our rabbis, in their commentary on our Torah, go even one step further, because they articulate that at any given moment in society, it might be your turn to be the person struggling this time. Most specifically, when we talk about the way that we cultivate our agriculture and leave the corners of our fields, which isn't this week's Torah portion, but stick around, we'll get to it. We make sure that we leave enough so that anybody who's hungry still has enough to eat. The rabbis explain that we do this because you don't know when it's going to be your turn to be so hungry that you need to go to the community and ensure you have enough food. And so if at any given moment we're positive we can feed everybody, we make sure that our social structure supports that notion in practice as well as in theory. This now brings us to our Torah portion for this week, which is Mishpatim. We've just had the revelation at Sinai of the Ten Commandments last week, this beautiful moment, this impactful moment, and now we get into the nitty-gritty details of what does it mean to build a society or a culture. And we read, "You shall not wrong a stranger or oppress them, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. You shall not treat ill any widow or orphan. If you do mistreat them, I will heed their outcry as soon as they cry out to me, and my anger shall blaze forth, and I will put you to the sword, and your own wives shall become widows, and your children orphans." Now, I know what you were thinking when you arrived this evening for services. You wanted to learn some biblical grammar. So, I want to point out, and let's see if we can use the laser pointer effectively. Ooh, look at that. Te'aneh, this word right here, is in the second person singular. Meanwhile, etchem down here is the more colloquial y'all. That is Torah, by the way. So when we see, I should have just written y'all in here, it would have made everything easier. If you do mistreat them, that's an individual. My anger shall blaze forth, and I shall put you, all of y'all, to the sword. Now, back to that notion of realism, we haven't seen God come down and smite anybody with a sword lately. But what we do read in this section of our Torah portion is that we are expected to demonstrate empathy and compassion for those who are encountering hardship. If you're a stranger, you should be treated with kindness because we know what that's like. We've been there before. And for the widows and the orphans, we should treat them well even if we don't know what that's like, because if we don't, God will make us know what that's like. Think about the intensity of language God is using here. God is saying that God will always side with those in society who need defending. And we have to be on the lookout for what does it mean to ensure that we're doing that before God has to take action. Because as our Torah seems to imply, if God has to do it, it isn't going to be pretty. Now again, we have the challenge that we have to fit this into the reality in which we live. No, we should not wait for God to come down with a sword and right wrongs that we see happening around us. That's not really how the paradigm works right now. And while we might like to believe that those who are cruel and unkind will be punished at some point, whether in this world or the world to come, I'm not sure I'm satisfied with holding off on enforcing that compassion and kindness. Enforcing compassion and kindness is not so much for us about going around and punishing those who aren't complying, but it's about modeling what does it look like to take ownership of creative solutions to our societal problems. We have a lot of things in our country and in our world that aren't going perfectly. And a lot of the reason that we don't improve some of those things is because they'd be incredibly complicated to figure out. One of the easiest examples is we've been talking a lot about how much money we invest in police. We invest a lot of money in police, so much so that we can argue whether or not it's necessary for city police officers to have tanks at their disposal and the kind of weapons that are available to them. Now, I'm not saying our police don't deserve to have the tools they need to enforce our laws and help us maintain a more structured society, but what would it look like if we took a percentage of their budget and instead funneled it into social services, like mental health care, and like social security nets that would allow the problems that eventually lead to crime to be solved a little better so that we don't need the police quite so aggressively down the road? Why don't we do that? Because it requires a level of creativity, investment, and infrastructure that terrifies us, to be perfectly honest. We are so afraid of letting the ball slip through our hands that we aren't willing to do something creative, even though the creative solution might be a better answer. What God is teaching us in this Torah portion, what we have to learn from one another is we need to be creative. We need to not put the rules ahead of the people who live the rules. We have to look around with kindness and compassion and say, what creative solutions are there for us that will allow us to create something more enduring, something more valuable, and something more sustainable? Another excellent or horrible example, depending on how you look at it, is the example of the way we deal with hunger in this country. COVID has hit our hungry population and our homeless population particularly hard. That's because among people in our congregation, one of the ways we combat hunger and homelessness is that we donate food and we serve at food pantries and homeless shelters. But with the spread of the virus, we have to choose all too often. Are we going to choose to feed people at the risk of having them come in and take their masks off and get each other sick? Or are we going to shut things down and hope they find food some other way until it's safe? Now let's be honest. I don't have the answer to this one. I don't have the solution all by myself. And that's not what our Torah is asking of us. Our Torah is asking us to think about what does it mean to put the needs of people at the epicenter? What does it mean to make every decision with the question in mind, how can we serve those who need serving best? As we imagine what it looks like to serve the hungry and the homeless, how do we fix the problems in and around homeless shelters, in and around food banks, to ensure that people aren't so hungry in the first place that those infrastructure are necessary and so strapped for resources as they are right now. We live in a complicated world. A world so complicated our Torah would have trouble explaining exactly how to apply the rules, because this is a society that worked very differently. But back to our original thought experiment, what does it look like for us to reimagine a community that puts us all in partnership, making sure that the floor is raised, even if it means dropping the ceiling a little bit? What does it look like for us to put the needs of the widow and the orphan and the stranger and all of those on the boundaries of society more on the epicenter, in order that we might ensure not only that if we ever become the ones who one day need those services, we're taken care of, but also, regardless of our own need, we can sleep well at night knowing that we have not endangered or put to risk anybody else while we sleep in comfort. Our Torah is a document that calls us to radical communal investment. We're expected to look up from ourselves, to look up from the singular you, and instead look to the communal y'all. What does it look like to hold each other accountable? And what does it look like to become creative in solving our problems so that we all may flourish and we may all know the gift of covenant, of revelation, and of creativity together? Shabbat shalom, everyone.